Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. In this video, we're going to talk about semiotics and structuralism. Now, these are not quite the same literary and critical theory, but they're close enough for my purposes. So structuralism as a whole, which includes a fairly respectable range of sub-disciplines, some of which I'll talk about, some of which I won't. Structuralism is essentially concerned with the organization of defined principles and relationships. So what does that mean? Well, when we look at, say, a school like the Russian formalists, for instance, they're one of the sort of early schools of structuralism. The Russian formalists were very interested in defining what literary techniques do. So what's the difference between a metaphor, an simile, and an analogy? How do metrics work? Poetic metrics like iambic pentameter, strochaic trimeter, whatever it is. How do these things work? And they were very interested in sort of categorizing and defining what these literary techniques do, how they function, what qualifies as a particular type of literary technique, etc., etc. The semioticians, and actually the Prague school is very similar to the Russian formalists. They're very much a related type of approach. Semioticians take a bit more of a overview, a bit of a larger approach, because semioticians are concerned with how language is fundamentally used to make meaning. So the semioticians really are a linguistics school. They are interested in language as such. And in particular, the semioticians are interested in sign systems. So what does that mean? Well, what the semioticians assert, broadly speaking here, there are a lot of different semioticians who take different approaches and have different ideas, but essentially the assumption of semiotics is that everything that conveys meaning has multiple components. At the very least, it has so there's let me make sure I'm remembering this correctly. There is the sign, that is a meaning-making unit, consists of a signifier and a signified. So a signifier is the thing itself. If I say book, the word book is the signifier. The signified is the thing that is intended, the thing that is meant by it. So if I say the word book and point to this, you know that this is the signified of the signifier book. So that's a very basic thing. The semioticians go into massive detail. People like Ferdinand de Saussure and Roland Barthes are extremely complex in the way that they assess how language, both written and spoken, is used to create meaning. It's incredibly complex. I'm not a big fan of semiotics, if I'm honest. I've read some things by Barthes, some things by Saussure. I've read some things by other people who draw on semiotics. And actually, that's one of the big things. Semiotics and structuralism more broadly influences a massive number of other people. Claude Lévi-Strauss is another big name in structuralism, and he takes still a different approach, in part because he's really an anthropologist. But what Claude Lévi-Strauss does is he looks at, and this is a very basic impression of Claude Lévi-Strauss. Again, he's much more complicated than this, but he looks at elements of culture, particularly early cultures, because again, he's an anthropologist, and he says, this is what this means. This is how this signifies within the culture. So for instance, what does the difference between raw food, cooked food mean? What does the difference between different types of pottery say about this culture, etc., etc.? So it's rooted in this idea that particular elements of the world, particular elements of meaning making, of language, etc., etc., convey specific things beyond just the literal, like direct meaning, that they have these defined structures through which they function, hence the term structuralism. So one of the things that's really helpful about structuralism is it defines the techniques, the strategies, the tools for meaning making. Again, the Russian formalists and the Prague school do this largely for literature, for poetry especially. How does poetry create meaning beyond just the words that are being said? The semioticians do this for linguistics. How do written or spoken words work to create meaning, to convey meaning, etc., etc.? Structuralist anthropology, for instance, gives us a sense of how cultures create meaning. This is really important, and actually is important for a broad range of disciplines, because these give us tools for critically reading different elements of language, art, and culture. We can understand how these things work by looking closely at them in themselves, and then appreciating how they fit within and signify within their cultural context. The other thing that's important about structuralism is that it influences a ton of other disciplines. For me, one of the main ones that I think of is psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic criticism, because Jacques Lacan is very fascinated. Mid-20th century French psychoanalyst is fascinated by structuralism. He's fascinated by semiotics and things like this. And he famously said, the unconscious is structured like a language. So the ideas of the semioticians, the structuralists, and the Russian formalists expand beyond just what they do. The other big one that's very much indebted to structuralism that immediately jumps out at me is the new critics. New criticism as a discipline is really inconceivable, especially without the foundation that the Russian formalists establish of here's how meaning is made within poetic structures through the tools and techniques of literary devices. One of the big critics of structuralism, which and I'll do a video about this discipline later on, is Jacques Derrida, who basically creates deconstruction as a literary and cultural analytical technique. What Derrida points out, and I think there's a good argument for this, I'm on board with Derrida for the most part with this critique, is that meaning escapes the limitations of the structures that the structuralists identify. There is more meaning, there are more echoes of meaning, echoes of purpose, than just the things that are immediately identifiable. Every sign system carries with it excess. So yeah, we can look at, say, a metaphor and say, all right, this is a poetic device. It serves this particular function. But what Derrida says is, aha, but wait, it serves more functions. It does more than that. It carries more meaning than just what you identify by saying, this is a metaphor, I've identified it as such. So this is one of the big issues with structuralism, because they're very, very focused on relationships between signifiers and signifieds, or whatever it happens to be. Because they're very interested in these structures, they tend to presume that the structure is all-encompassing, or that the structure has full explanatory power. And even when they don't explicitly say that, and I think most of them probably don't explicitly say that, the very assumptions of structuralism as a discipline tend to promote that idea that whatever it is that you're analyzing, whether it's poetry, whether it's linguistics, whether it's culture, whatever it is, can be understood as a series of structures that generate meaning.